Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Zoe, and it is an absolute honour to be here today for Neurocon 2025 to present my topic. Before we begin, just a little bit of context about me. I originate from Melbourne, Australia, and I am a licensed social worker. I spent the last almost 10 years living abroad, working as a trauma therapist in Thailand, conducting doctoral research in Cambodia in the area of trauma and resilience. I've worked in a clinical capacity from Mauritius more recently for almost 5 years before returning to Australia just a few months ago. So I am joining you all from sunny Cairns, Australia, right up north. Within the last decade, I've been working with clients in a clinical capacity, and I'll be sharing lots of examples from the world of neuroscience, of course, but also the very human side of this topic as we move through. There's been some fabulous research around the impact of our digital and online behaviours, not only on the human brain, but on our society as a whole. So this topic is really at the intersection of that. How does the content that we are looking at affect us? What's happening with our brain? What are some of the broader, far-reaching impacts? And then, of course, what can be done? So my aim is to unpack all of this and then land with some really, hopefully useful suggestions for all of you. To begin, I'd like you all to consider first how long you spend on social media. And in my role as a clinical consultant, I quite literally speak to the world. I run sessions to hundreds of people on a regular basis. And I love what I do because I get a temperature check on what's happening with various regions in the world, what's concerning people. And first, I hear from parents all the time about their concerns and worries. How much social media for my child, at what age, what are the parameters, what rules should I have in place? But then also the younger generation that are very tech savvy. We have our Gen Zs. I might be talking to some of you in the audience that are Gen Zs. The comfort and normality of spending hours a day on social media is more present with the younger generations. But I also hear from people globally that say, Instagram was getting out of control, so I have limited, I set boundaries, phone alarms, I have all of these strategies in place to limit how much social media. But when we look at global research, the majority of us are spending 2.5 hours a day. I don't know about you, but I was shocked when I was looking at some of the statistics. I've read others that suggest it's more like 3 hours a day. This is more than we spend collectively doing other activities such as exercising and socializing. So it's become such a huge part of our daily life. Before we jump into the neuroscience and the impact of social media and other forms of content, what I'd like to talk about is our survival instincts to sort of lay the foundation. Our nervous system and our brain are hardwired for threats in our environment. And we were, for lack of a better choice of words, better designed for more simpler times. Oh, look, there's a lion. I'm going to run really fast in the other direction, or fight the lion, or freeze and try to save and protect myself from danger. And our digital environments can create these almost micro threats, because it doesn't matter if that threat is real or perceived. If you think it's a threat, you're going to experience it on your stress response system. So your nervous system and your brain is going to view that particular content perhaps as a threat, as if you have a metaphorical lion in some instances sitting in your lounge room right now. And what happens as well is, unlike, oh, there's a lion, how often would I be seeing a lion back in the day, depending on where I live? But in today's day and age, we might be constantly bombarded with threats. When I ask the globe, what are your major concerns today? I hear about economic instability, cost of living. So people have a real fear around their financial stability. What might happen if they lose their job? Are they able to provide for their families? So this is going to create a high amount of stress. Then, when we look at war, geopolitical factors, depending on how close you are, and even if you are very far away from a war zone, we might be viewing that online and it might feel a lot closer. So instead of being able to recover from a big event like a lion, we have these micro threats throughout the course of the day. And consider in the last 24 hours, how many times has your stress response been activated? It might have been an email from your manager where you've thought, what was that about? Do they not like the work that I did? And we can move into a state of, well, response because there's the threat. And I'd like you all to consider what types of content trigger the strongest stress response for you. I'm going to give you some examples from clients that I've worked with because we're not all the same. One of my clients has changed careers recently and feels very essentially not good enough in comparison to their peers. So every time they're on LinkedIn, they're comparing where people are in their world, what's happened in their career trajectory, and then placing it on back onto themselves, what I'm not doing, where I should be, and this internal critic emerges that is not very kind, let's put it that way. And then other times, one of my clients who works in marketing, so her role is very much involved with these apps. She finds she looks at a lot of short form content on TikTok about ways in which to improve one's life. She said, I can watch hours of this and I come off thinking, I'm not exercising enough. I don't have enough green smoothies. I'm not doing enough to look after myself. And I'm looking at all of these Instagrammers that have these amazing bodies. And I feel like the reason that I'm overweight is because I'm just not taking care of myself in the way that I should. So she gives herself a hard time around her body image, comparison to Instagram, and also feeling like, well, I'm watching how I should be in my life on TikTok, but then it having the reverse effect. It's not inspiring or motivating. It's telling her everything she's not doing properly. And then we might be, and we'll talk separately about doom scrolling, but some of you might be looking at horrendous content and finding yourself stuck in an algorithm of wars, of politics, and things that you're finding yourself feeling really distressed or perhaps getting really angry about. I had to deliberately change what was happening with my algorithms by, no, I don't want to see any more of this content because I was finding any news from the US right now, I just get really angry about. So I found that I was having to limit what I was seeing. So thinking about you, what you're engaging in, and what are your responses? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it fear? Some of you might be watching cat videos and you find that you leave that interaction feeling really happy because you love cats. I mean, I love cats. But some of you might have a mix. Others of you might be using your apps to keep in contact with family members all over the world. I don't want to come from a place of all social media is bad, but what we see in the research is there are some pros for sure, but there is also a lot of negatives. And of course, we're about to talk about trauma. So when we're comparing our body, for example, with a famous Instagrammer that we follow, this is not necessarily trauma. But what is the tipping point? And how can we be aware of particular symptoms? So let's say, for example, you are looking at very distressing content and it is triggering your stress response. You might feel a few degrees warmer, your heart rate might elevate, you might experience feelings of anxiety and or fear. What happens is it starts to seep into other areas of our life. We might wake up in the middle of the night, have disrupted sleep, intrusive thoughts in the middle of the day. You're sitting down, focusing on a work task, and you're finding yourself thinking about content. You might find that you're feeling exhausted and fatigued, but that's not necessarily related to sleep. So nervous system dysregulation, we find that when people have these peaks of either heightened anxiety and or fear, we crash. What we also see is that when we have been in a state of prolonged stress for an extended period of time, many people will numb by picking up all kinds of things, sometimes more social media, other times it might be online shopping, gambling, gaming, alcohol, other substances. And the aim is to feel less of that activation. And certainly in my field, working with trauma, we often see alcohol being used as a way that people self-medicate trauma symptoms. Nightmares, flashbacks, high anxiety, panic attacks, these are all symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And alcohol is a nervous system depressant. So it works temporarily. And then because alcohol is ethanol, it's a poison that the body has to work twice as hard in order to flush from the system, thus exacerbating symptoms of PTSD. So you can see how someone might get into a really nasty cycle of trying to numb and to minimize some of these trauma symptoms and then actually making them worse. And let's talk more about doom scrolling. Doom scrolling, the terminology came out, emerged more in 2020, where the vast majority of us were glued to our screens watching the pandemic unfold. And it's not just in our social media streams that we find distressing content. In fact, historically, let's take 9/11, for example. Prior to any kind of social media, but the same thing happened globally. And what we found was that millions of people around the world experienced symptoms of vicarious trauma, even though they were not American, had nothing directly to do with what was happening in the US, but they'd watched those images on repeat again and again and again. So the media has been linked to vicarious trauma, and let me give you a better definition first of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma, also known as secondary trauma, is when people experience trauma symptoms that I described before, nightmares, flashbacks, high anxiety, as a result of hearing, witnessing the trauma, but not being directly affected. So there are occupations that are more susceptible to vicarious trauma. Mine, for example, so therapists, emergency services, frontline responders, and human rights organizations where individuals might spend their time at the front line of human suffering. I had a beautiful session not long ago with the EMEA region, and some were talking about how they worked in tech and digital, but they were compiling data of HIV spread across regions. And they said that they would come home at the end of the day and just cry. So what we see with vicarious trauma is it can be numbers on a Excel spreadsheet, or it can be seeing graphic news reports. So any kind of exposure to trauma can lead to vicarious trauma. So doom scrolling, what are you looking at? And there have been times where, yes, the pandemic is a great example. We looked at something and then all of a sudden our newsfeed was full of that particular content, but not everyone is affected in the same way. Some of us are quite capable of looking at distressing content on the news and thinking, oh, that's terrible. And then 5 minutes later, so what's for dinner? And we're able to compartmentalize that. Some of us are more susceptible. In the research, what emerges is women and people with trauma histories. And this is an interesting link. Let's take, for example, someone who has had complex trauma in their childhood. They've had, by complex trauma, I mean multiple trauma events. And this has shaped often their nervous system and how they interact and engage with the world. We find that people who have lived through extensive trauma, they have often an overactive nervous system. So it's more likely to move into that fight, flight, freeze as a way of responding to triggers, even if the trigger is not necessarily a threat. So, for example, I've worked with trauma survivors who have spent time in prison and have returned from a war zone that are very hypervigilant. They are hardwired for threats because that's what has kept them safe in those traumatic environments. Domestic violence sufferers also can be hypervigilant. So people with that kind of history might be triggered a lot more from distressing content, and they have a higher chance of being re-traumatized, particularly if it triggers their own trauma history. Now, without stepping too far into the realm of individuals working with trauma in a clinical practice, but there is a term coined by Jung that I've always been very fond of, famous psychotherapists that work with Freud. Jung used the term wounded healer as a way of describing psychotherapists that work with people in a clinical capacity, essentially to heal their wounds. You don't need to be a therapist to be a wounded healer. I see this in lots of different professions where people come first. I've seen teachers, I've seen people in organizations that are the go-to ones on their team, very supportive, very caring and compassionate, and they're wounded healers. They like to help other people. Wounded healers are definitely more susceptible for vicarious trauma as well. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens in the brain. So our amygdala, fight, flight, freeze, is often kind of nicknamed, or this area, the reptilian part of the brain, because it's more of a basic system that we share with other animals. I've always appreciated Dr. Dan Siegel's flip the lid model. Bear with me now. So he's a psychiatrist that works with children, and he talks about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So using his hand model, the thumb is the amygdala, the base of the brain where we focus on threats. But when there is a heightened fear or a real sense of threat, it disengages with the prefrontal cortex, essentially flipping the lid, as he says. And that's our prefrontal cortex is our ability to emotionally reason and understand long-term consequences. A great example as to the why of this, if I was to walk out into oncoming traffic and a car flew around the corner, if I accessed my prefrontal cortex and emotionally reasoned the situation, should I turn left or turn right at this point? I might be dead by the time I've had that thought process. So the amygdala takes over, and hopefully I'm going to automatically jump back onto the pavement in which to save my life. But what happens is that the more that this is activated, cortisol remains elevated in the body. And cortisol, as many of you will know, has been linked with heart disease, high blood pressure, and a host of other physical health issues. In short, sharp bursts, it's actually, it's completely harmless. It's there to keep us alive. But a great study that came from Stanford University about cortisol levels and how it's not all bad. They took a group of research participants and they injected them with E. coli, and then they put them in an ice bath, and no one in the study got E. coli. And it showed that by peaking cortisol levels and you submerge yourself in ice, your body is going to have a stress response because it's, well, freezing. And in that, it switches on our immune system, along with being quite helpful for us to cope. But because it's controlled and it's a very short burst, this is fine. Prolonged, extended periods of stress while cortisol is flooding your system does the exact opposite to the immune system. It makes us more susceptible for all kinds of colds and viruses that are going around. And it also becomes harder for our nervous system to return to a baseline. And so these cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine, these hormones essentially very much affect our ability to then emotionally regulate as well. So you might find that people are more reactive because it's that fight, flight, freeze, but then that stays with them. They're more likely to have a heightened stress response or reaction to something. And when we think about our threat circuit, if everything is a threat, how do we feel safe in our life? And I remember once I was in Myanmar. I was doing some human rights contracts, and I was talking to some of the amazing social workers that were in the field working with refugees, and they were talking about conditions and essentially the ongoing trauma. And I remember sitting there and thinking, how can any trauma treatment take place when there's still so much threat in an existing environment? Because when people tell me that they want to work on their trauma, yes, this is possible, but the very first thing that we need before we can do that is safety. So if your brain is constantly being activated by possible threats in your environment, this is not creating that level of safety where we can start to heal. So the recommendations in terms of daily screen time, there's no universal fixed global limit, although most experts will agree over 5 hours a day is problematic. So if we are using a lot of this for our work as well, some of us will be, what we might like to do is think about what are the limits for me? And I'd also like you all to consider it's not a one size fits all, and it will depend on what you're looking at as well. But what we see is that if you are engaging with video chats and you're online talking to people, and I was thinking about this recently because I'm in the process of writing an academic article on AI and loneliness. And according to new Harvard University research, AI can improve loneliness for a lot of people, which I thought was really interesting because most of the research there around that is all of the negative impacts similar to social media in terms of how we're engaging with AI. It's far from flawless. Interesting research, though. And our online activity that connects us to other people is going to be much more beneficial, of course, than doom scrolling. So you might like to think about setting yourself daily screen time settings based on your needs, your requirements, your work, your social connection, and having some healthy boundaries. Because what neuroscience suggests is there is a reduction to gray matter in the brain. And another piece of research for those of you who say, okay, I'm online all the time, what can be done to increase my gray matter? According to Stanford, stretching. They've done a wonderful piece of research on yogis. And in this research, first of all, defining a yogi as someone who practices at least 1 hour of yoga for an extended period of time, so years, every day. And they had higher levels of gray matter. And what the research pointed to is when you're in your end ranges for stretching, so my fitness people will know what that means. So you're stretching as far as you can in your end range without pain, without hurting yourself, but it's discomfort. This right here increases gray matter. So you might like to think, well, I'm doing a lot on social media for work, then I'm going to become a yogi to increase gray matter. So there is a link. But what is another really problematic area is the digital platform algorithms are set to keep us scrolling. So we can put in all of these limits, but then we might get really captured by something that is playing on repeat. And what research points to in this area is we are a lot less likely to question the validity of a source when we are getting it in 60-second sound bites. This is another really problematic area because if I was to show you all an article on, let's say, a major accident or something awful that's happened in the world, you might look at this and criticize or critique the author's standpoint, or you might think that's not the full picture, or this is missing because we apply our logic. But if I was to give you that same soundbite in 30 seconds and then pack it in with all of these other reels, the chances of you being able to critically analyze the basis of that is far less. And I know that I have felt this when you get to the end of scrolling for an hour, how much of that information do we actually retain? But it's an absolute sea of visual images, and some of which might cause distress. And before we've been able to either even register that distress, we're on to the next thing. And it's also unpredictable. Something might capture your attention, but that engagement is interesting because when we've done, neuroscientists have done MRI scans, it mimics the same mechanisms seen in gambling, and that's all about dopamine. So dopamine is that reward molecule which rewards us for certain behavior, and the algorithms are absolutely set up for that. So anything that you engage with, you're going to see more of. Next question for the group. What personal habits have made you reconsider your own relationship with digital tools? So what were some of those tipping points for you? And I think personally, it's not, I'm smiling when I say this, it's not actually the social media for me. It's that my husband sometimes emails me with the name of the organization I'm affiliated with and under urgent, because I'm always very hardwired to respond to emails and I might not have seen his text messages. So that has made me consider, well, how attentive am I to the VIP individuals in my world, which is not just my work, but what am I also losing time on? I like to think about things in terms of balance. I'm not going to stop some of my online activity. I have a business Facebook page. I try to be a little bit more active on LinkedIn. It makes me uncomfortable, but I'm trying because I feel like this is beneficial for my brand, so to speak. So I see benefits here. But I'm also aware that I can lose time when going for a walk in nature would be a much better self-care activity, particularly with the work that I do in terms of trauma. I need to be very, very aware of the impact that that's having and then not be doom scrolling afterwards or looking at news coming from the US that I just get very angry about. This is not a good use of my time. It doesn't help my nervous system recover and stabilize. So how do platforms sort of hijack the brain? Well, I talked about dopamine bursts, and this is the reason that social media can be an addiction in and of itself. When I relocated to Thailand, I was working in an inpatient treatment setting and we had a youth program. And I wasn't directly affiliated with that, but I used to hear from the therapists about so many of their young clients that were accessing for social media addiction, internet addiction, because you have a developing brain and that makes them more susceptible to changes in the brain structure based on habits and what they're engaging with. And that novelty bias it creates that interest that we keep wanting to engage in. And this is why those circuits mirror that for other types of addiction. And sometimes people seem to have this viewpoint that social media addiction or online activity is not as bad as the hard drugs, illegal hard drugs. And I would argue that it depends on the outcome, because I've seen social media addiction and we see some of the calling cards of addiction: isolation and withdrawal from family and friends, a loss of interest in activities previously enjoyed, lying and manipulating, and a sense of need, and essentially being controlled by either a substance and or a process such as social media, where someone needs to have their fix for hours a day, and they feel immense discomfort when they're not engaging with that process addiction. So that's at addiction levels. Not everyone will reach that, but that compulsive checking that we have about our phones, we need to stay in contact. We need to know what's happening. It becomes harder and harder to disengage. And let's look at some of the broader implications. It is a lot more than just the individual who is affected. And our early years of COVID were an excellent example of this. Some of us desensitized because of the constant exposure. It normalizes horrendous events. And sometimes I believe we do this in order to keep ourselves safe. Our nervous system, with the constant activation, we just disengage completely. But then it can erode empathy. In my work with clients globally, I often ask the question, what is the worst thing that someone has told you when you have mentioned that you're struggling with mental health? What is the best thing that they've told you? And I hear about the empathy. I hear people reaching out and saying, I'm really sorry that you're going through this. Thank you for telling me this. I really appreciate you sharing this with me. What can I do? How can I help? Excellent. Demonstrating a lot of empathy. But then I also hear sentences that start with "at least." My personal favorite recently was a participant in a group said to me they had shared with their colleague that was struggling with anxiety, and their colleague said, at least it's not cancer, because cancer is very bad. And you can just do some breathing exercises and you'll be fine. So this is an empathy. And sometimes we live in a world of toxic positivity that talks to, well, at least you don't have cancer, or at least you still have a job, or at least you're still healthy. Think about all the other people who are suffering. Now, yes, people are suffering, but that's not relative to an individual's experience of suffering. And particularly in this world where there is a climate of fear and distrust, we see this whenever we turn on the news. We see more and more right-wing extremist behaviors occurring. We see a lot more, what I would argue, fear that drives binary ways of thinking. And this is very much the neuroscience. When you keep people in fear and you keep them in that fight, flight, freeze, they are so much more reactive. They're completely unwilling to look at and to see other people's points of view. And that's having huge impacts. I've been very critical of American media here, but I see that very much emerge with certain news streams where it propagates that fear. And so people are constantly in fear. And the generational impact is that young people have either become desensitized or they have a heightened vulnerability because they're constantly being exposed to these things. And 70% of, the World Health Organization estimates that 70% of us will have at least one trauma experience in the course of our life. So when we talk about people with trauma being more susceptible to online traumatic content, not everyone that has a trauma will experience trauma symptoms. But we need to be thinking about, of course, trauma is going to show up in our workplaces, in our families, in terms of our communities as well. And vicarious trauma, that secondary trauma that I mentioned before, there are groups that are more susceptible. And of course, refugees, people that are experiencing trauma, are then also more inclined to have further trauma as a result of secondary and vicarious trauma. It can also be spread. And I know that, take, for example, a social worker that I worked with in the field of Cambodia. They were working with, my research was with trauma survivors that had grown up to be incredibly resilient adults. All of them had a background of trafficking and modern day slavery. So we're talking about considerable trauma. And I met some amazing human beings, but I also met social workers, also amazing human beings, and psychologists that were working with children that had been sexually abused under the age of 12. And that's some really hard work. And I was really curious as to what kind of self-care they were practicing, how they were looking after themselves, because they were being exposed to horrendous trauma. And a lot of them talked about limiting media and limiting news from other parts of the world and being very selective as to what they were listening to. A lot of them talked about, and I'll talk strategies in a moment, but a lot of them talked about faith, about spirituality, about social connection, about finding hope. So they had all of these strategies to enable them to continue to show up to work every day and hear horrendous stories of trauma and abuse. So it highlights the need for trauma-informed and also neuroscience-based based responses to conflict, to people working with trauma. And why is that? What is the neuroscience behind vicarious trauma? And there's been a lot of research done on mirror neurons and how we are essentially hardwired to connect with each other. And I always find it interesting when I see people's body language matching each other. So you might find that two people are having a close conversation, one leans in like this, the other leans in like that, and we match and mirror. And we have, through our prefrontal cortex, this incredible ability to put ourselves into another person's shoes. Whereas other animals that do not have a prefrontal cortex do not have that ability. And so it underpins the neural basis of vicarious trauma because we can empathize, because we can essentially feel what someone else is feeling just for a moment. We might not have the exact same feelings, but we can identify with that. And we can see that certain regions of the brain light up in terms of empathy. And in that pattern, so that repeated exposure leads to the neural overload. And what we see with compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma is that it presents very much like burnout. You might find someone who is pulling away, doesn't feel anything. And I remember when I first started in working with trauma, I found that I was waking up in the middle of the night having nightmares about uh, what was happening with my clients. I'd wake up thinking about how I could help them. And I was also experiencing a sense of numbing because I'd stopped feeling things in sessions. And I was lucky because I'd taken some time to have an extended holiday. But I believe, looking back, that I was edging towards either burnout and or vicarious trauma. So let's talk about resilience strategies. We have the ability to regulate our own usage. There needs to be far more focus on media literacy, trauma-informed workplaces. We know that trauma is so common, so we need to be planning for that. Now, I would love a bit more ethical design in terms of our social media apps and being understood or regulating and harmful content. But when we look at content moderators, we see that people who are exposed online to hours of distressing content have trauma symptoms. There's a huge body of research around content moderators. So our resilience solutions, thinking about it from where you're sitting, what are you organized with? What can you do to make a difference to yourself, to your family, to your community? What kinds of policies might we be looking at? What kind of breaks from our social media, whether that is mindfulness, meditation, movement, exercise, social connection, those real self-care messages. How do you take care of yourself? Understanding that hours of distressing content is going to drain your resilience. So by picking up on some of the things in this slide that might be helpful for you and implementing that into your life. So which level of change do you think is the most important? What can be done? How can we all play a role in supporting others around us? So just as a closing reflection, digital habits, we have some control. It is very much exploiting our reward pathways, our dopamine, our stress system gets hijacked. Vicarious trauma is real and can occur for you depending on what you're looking at. Resilience is also possible. So thinking about those self-care strategies that specifically apply to you. So that brings me to the end of the session. I have written an academic article on this topic as well. So for those of you that would like a bit more of a deep dive, please feel free to access that on ResearchGate, along with all of my other academic articles if you're interested, or connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you all for listening today, and I hope you got something helpful and useful out of this session. Take care and bye-bye.